My name is Amira Hassan. I am 13 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and I have lived here my whole life. I go to a regular middle school. I like math. I love drawing. And my favorite food is my mom's chicken and rice, which she makes with this spice mix she brought from Jordan and refuses to share the recipe for even with her closest friends. I tell you these small things first because I want you to know that I am a normal girl. I am not a special person. I did not grow up in a church. Nobody came to my house with a Bible when I was little. No missionary knocked on our door. Nothing dramatic happened to start any of this. At least not in the way most people would expect dramatic things to happen. I was just a little girl, growing up in a regular house, with a regular family. And then something happened to me that I still cannot fully explain with my own words, but I am going to try. I am going to try my best to tell you everything. But first, I have to tell you about the house I was born into, because to understand what happened to me and what happened to my family, you have to understand where we started. You have to understand what our life looked like before everything changed. And I think once you hear it, you will understand why what happened to us was not a small thing. It was not a simple or easy thing. It cost us something. And what came out on the other side of that cost is the whole reason I am sitting here telling you this story today. My father's name is Tariq Hassan.
Hello, viewers from around the world. Before our sister Amira Hassan continues her story, we'd love to know where you are watching from, and we would love to pray for you and your city. Thank you, and may God bless you as you listen to this powerful testimony.
He was born in Amman, Jordan. He came to America when he was 24 years old with 2 suitcases, a little bit of money, and a strong belief that if he worked hard enough, he could build a life here. He had a degree in engineering from a university in Jordan, but when he first got to America, that degree did not immediately open the doors he thought it would. So he worked wherever he could while he figured things out. He worked in a warehouse, he drove for a delivery company for a while. He learned the way America worked from the inside out, from the ground up, and slowly, over time, things got better for him. He got a job in his actual field. He started building the life he had imagined. He met my mother, Nadia, through family connections. She was also Jordanian, and she had come to America with her parents when she was a teenager. My mother grew up here in Columbus, went to school here, and by the time she met my father, she was already comfortable moving between 2 worlds in a way my father was still learning. She spoke English without any accent. She knew American culture, but she also knew who she was. She had not lost that. Her family had made sure of that. They got married, and then after a few years, they had me. And then 2 years later, my brother Youssef was born. The house I grew up in was warm. I want to make sure I say that clearly. We were not an unhappy family. My parents loved each other, and they loved us. There was always food. There was always noise and movement and life in our home. My mother was the kind of woman who could have 10 people over for dinner without any warning, and somehow there would be enough food for everyone. My father worked very hard, sometimes very long hours, but when he was home, he was present. He would sit with us. He would ask about school. He would tell us stories about Jordan, about his childhood, about his parents and his brothers. He wanted us to know where we came from, even though we were growing up somewhere else. But our home was also clearly and without any confusion a Muslim home. There was a framed Arabic calligraphy on the wall near the front door. It said Bismillah, which means in the name of God, and it was the first thing you saw when you walked in. There were prayer rugs folded in the corner of my parents' room. My father prayed 5 times a day, and when he was home, he did not miss those prayers. He would stop whatever he was doing, go get the rug, face the direction of Mecca, and pray. As a small child, I used to sometimes sit near the door of the room and watch him. There was something serious about it, something that felt important and heavy. Even as a 4 or 5-year-old, I could feel that this was not just a routine to him. This was real. This mattered to him deeply. My mother prayed too, though perhaps not always with the same strict regularity as my father. But her faith was just as real. She fasted during Ramadan every year without complaint. She taught me and my brother how to read the Arabic letters from the Quran. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with her in the evenings, sounding out the letters, trying to get the pronunciation right, and she would gently correct me without ever making me feel bad for getting it wrong. She used to say that the words of the Quran were like medicine, that they were good for the soul, even when you did not understand every single word of what you were reading. We were not expected to just recite the words. We were supposed to feel them. Ramadan was the biggest part of our year. Looking back now, I think Ramadan was when our family felt most like itself. My father would come home early from work during that month. The house smelled like cooking from the afternoon onwards because my mother would be preparing the food we would eat at sunset, when the fast broke. We would all sit together at the table and my father would make a small prayer, and then we would eat. There was something about that moment, breaking the fast together after a whole day of nothing, that felt sacred, even to me as a child. I did not have the words for it then. I just knew that those evenings felt different. They felt connected. They felt like we were all holding onto something together. There was also the community aspect of our faith. We were not the only Muslim family in Columbus, not by a long way. There was a mosque about 20 minutes from our house, and my father went there for Friday prayers every week. On Eid, we would go together as a family, all dressed up, and there would be hundreds of people there. Families from Pakistan, from Egypt, from Somalia, from all over, all gathered in one place. As a small child, those Eid gatherings were exciting. There was color and food and people hugging each other and children running around. I remember feeling proud in those moments, proud to belong to something large. Proud to be part of something that stretched across so many countries and so many faces. So I want to be honest about something. I was not unhappy in my faith. I was not suffering. I was not secretly miserable and looking for a way out. I think sometimes when people hear conversion stories, they assume the person must have been in pain or lost or mistreated, and that they found something because they needed something to fill a wound. That was not my story. My story is different, and I think that is part of why it is hard to explain and also part of why I believe so strongly that what happened to me was real and not just emotional. I was a happy child in a good home. I had faith. I had a family. I had a community. And still, something found me, something reached me, and it was not because I was empty, it was because I was curious. And because God, I believe, put that curiosity in me, before I was old enough to understand what I was curious about. I should tell you about school because school is where this whole story really begins to move. I started kindergarten at a public school near our house. It was a regular American public school, the kind where the classrooms have alphabet charts on the walls and there are cubbies for your backpack, and your teacher is always trying to get you to sit still during carpet time. I loved school from the very beginning. I was a social child. I liked people. I liked talking. I liked learning. I did not experience kindergarten as strange or difficult, even though our home life was different from many of my classmates' homes. But I noticed things even at 5 years old. I noticed that some of the things my classmates talked about were things I had no knowledge of. Christmas was the biggest example. In December, the whole school changed. There were decorations. There was Christmas music playing. The teachers were excited in a different way. My classmates talked about what they were going to get for Christmas, what they wanted, what their families did. I would come home and ask my mother about Christmas, and she would explain to me calmly that we did not celebrate Christmas because we were Muslim, that we had our own holidays, and that our holidays were just as special. And I accepted that. It made sense to me as a young child. I had Eid. My classmates had Christmas. We had different things, but even in accepting it, I was curious. What was the story behind Christmas? Why did it make people so happy? I asked my mother about Jesus because I had heard his name in December. Conversations at school. She told me, in the way that Muslims tell the story, that Jesus was a prophet, a good man, an important prophet actually, one of the most important, but a prophet, a human being, not the Son of God the way Christians believed. Because God, she explained, does not have a son. That is not how we understood God. God was one. God was alone. God had no partners and no children. That was the foundation of what we believed. I accepted that too. I was a child. You accept what your parents tell you about these things when you are small. But I kept wondering. I kept watching, I kept noticing the way Christmas made people feel, and Easter, and even just the way some of my classmates talked about going to church with their families on Sundays. There was something in how they talked about it. Not all of them. Some of them talked about church the way you talk about something boring you have to do. But a few of them talked about it differently. A few of them talked about it like it was something they actually looked forward to, something that was part of the best parts of their week. I filed that away somewhere in my brain without knowing that I was filing it away. As I got older and moved through elementary school, the differences became more textured and complex, but also more normal to me. I was used to being slightly on the outside of certain conversations. Whenever the school had a holiday concert in December, I would participate because it was a school event, but I was aware that the songs being sung were not my songs. I was aware that the story being told in December was not my story. I did not feel bad about that. I just noticed it. I also noticed something else as I got older. I noticed that some people looked at me differently when they found out I was Muslim. After a certain age, there was sometimes a pause, a very brief pause, when I told someone my name or when they found out about my family. Nothing anyone ever said to me was cruel, at least not when I was in elementary school, but I could feel the pause. I could feel the moment of adjustment. And I understood, even as a young child, that there were ideas about Muslims in the world, ideas that were not always kind, and that I was going to have to live inside those ideas without having created them. My father talked to me and my brother about this. He sat us down at different points in our childhood and explained that we were going to encounter people who did not understand us, people who had been told wrong things about who we were and what we believed. He told us that the best thing we could do was live our lives with honesty and integrity and let our character speak for itself. He was not bitter when he said these things. He was practical. He was preparing us. And I appreciated that, even though at the time I did not fully understand how complicated that navigation was going to become. Let me tell you about who I was as a child because I think it matters. I was a talker. I still am. I have always been the kind of person who wants to understand things, who asks questions when something does not make sense, who is not satisfied with a surface answer when I can tell there is more underneath it. This is part of my personality that I believe God put in me specifically, because it was that particular quality and that restlessness about wanting to understand, wanting to go deeper, that ended up being the thing that cracked everything open. I also had a very active interior life. I know that sounds like a strange thing for a child to say about herself, but it is true. From a fairly young age, I spent a lot of time inside my own head. I thought about big questions. I thought about why things were the way they were. I thought about God, even when I did not have the language for what I was thinking. I used to lie in bed at night as a 7 or 8-year-old and think about what God was like. Not the rules, not the prayers, not the fasting, but the actual being of God, what God actually was, whether God knew me specifically, whether God thought about me the way I thought about things that mattered to me. In the version of God I had grown up with, God was very large, very powerful, very present in the sense that everything came from God and everything returned to God, but also in some ways very distant. In the way I had been taught to relate to God, there was always a sense of enormous distance. God was above everything, separate from everything, incomprehensibly greater than everything. You prayed to God. You submitted to God. You obeyed God's laws because they were good laws and because obedience was the correct response to someone so much greater than you. I did not doubt that God existed. I never doubted that. From the time I was old enough to understand the idea of God, I was certain that God was real. That certainty never wavered, but something else was growing in me alongside that certainty, something I could not name. For a long time, it was like a question that did not have words yet. It was somewhere in my chest, not in my head. It was a feeling more than a thought. A feeling like, is this it? Is this everything? Is the whole story of what God is and how God relates to me just this? Just rules and prayers and submission? Is there not something more personal than this? Is there not something that reaches closer? I feel strange saying that, because I know it might sound like I am criticizing the faith I grew up in, and I do not mean it as a criticism. I know there are Muslims who have a very deep and personal relationship with God within Islam. My own parents, especially my father, had something real and genuine in his faith. I could see it. What I am describing is something that was specific to me, specific to how I was wired, specific to the kind of person I was. I was a child who needed to feel personally known by God. I was a child who needed relationship more than religion, though I did not know that was what I needed. I just felt the lack of something without being able to describe the shape of what was missing. And that lack, that quiet interior hunger, was what God was going to use. Not my suffering, not a crisis, not even a dramatic event. Just a quiet, persistent question in a little girl's chest. Just a heart that was already leaning toward something before it knew what it was leaning toward. There is one more thing I want to tell you about in this first part of my story, and it is something that I have thought about many times since everything happened. There was a period when I was about 8 years old where I was very sick. It was nothing life-threatening, but at the time it felt enormous to me. I had a bad infection in my lungs, and I had to stay home from school for almost 3 weeks. I was feverish and uncomfortable, and I spent most of those weeks in my bed. My mother took care of me. She barely left my side during the worst of it. She would sit next to me and read to me or just be there. And during the nights, when the fever was high and I was scared and unable to sleep, I would call out for her and she would come. There was one particular night where I remember feeling very frightened. Not about dying, because I did not really think I was dying, but frightened in that formless way that sick children feel frightened in the middle of the night. Frightened of the darkness and the feeling of my body not being right and the distance between me and normal. And I remember lying there and saying something in my head that I am not sure was a proper prayer. It was not in Arabic. It was not in any formal prayer language. It was just me in my head talking to God the way you talk to someone in the room with you. I said something like, "Please, I need you to be here right now." And something happened. I cannot prove it. I cannot explain it scientifically. But something in the room changed. Or something in me changed. There was a warmth that came. That was not from my blankets. There was a quiet that came into my chest that was not from the medicine. And I felt very clearly not alone. I felt heard. I felt close to something bigger than me in a way that was not frightening, but was actually the most comforting thing I had ever experienced up to that point, in my 8 years of life. I did not tell anyone about that night for a very long time. Not my mother, not my father. I kept it inside. But I thought about it often. I thought about it because it did not match the version of God I had been taught in a precise way. In the version I had been taught, God was great and God was merciful, yes. But what I felt that night was something even more intimate than mercy from a great distance. What I felt that night was presence. Close, warm, personal presence. I did not know then what to call that or who that presence was. I just knew it was real. I knew it happened. And I carried that knowledge with me through the next couple of years as I kept growing, I kept wondering, I kept being the curious, interior, question-filled little girl that I was. Looking back now, I believe that night was not random. I believe something was already at work in my life long before I ever opened a Bible or stepped inside a church or heard a proper sermon about Jesus. I believe the God who is close was already reaching toward me when I was 8 years old in a sick bed in Columbus, Ohio. I believe he answered a prayer I prayed to him without even knowing his full name yet. And I believe that the warmth I felt that night was the same presence that would later show itself to me so clearly and completely that I would not be able to walk away from it, not even if I wanted to. I did not want to. That is the thing. When it was finally clear, when everything finally made sense, I did not want to walk away. I ran toward it, even as an 11-year-old girl who understood what it was going to cost her and her family. Even knowing the difficulty that was coming, I ran toward it, because you do not walk away from something that has been looking for you your whole life. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is for later. For now, I just want you to sit with the picture of who I was and where I came from. A girl from a good family, a Muslim home, a Middle Eastern heritage, a warm mother and a hard-working, faithful father, a brother who drove me crazy in the way that younger brothers are designed to do, a school where I was slightly on the outside of some conversations, a heart full of questions that did not have answers yet, a memory of one night in a sick bed that I kept folded up inside me like something precious that I did not yet understand. That is where this story begins. That is the house I was born into. And that is the girl who was going to find something, or perhaps be found by something, that would change not just her own life, but the lives of every single person in that house. I did not know any of that was coming. I was just a kid, but God knew. And I believe with everything in me that He had been preparing the way for a very long time before I ever took the first step. I want to tell you about a girl named Destiny. Destiny Williams came into my life in the 3rd grade when I was 8 going on 9, and she changed everything without either of us understanding that was what was happening. She sat 2 seats away from me in our classroom, and she was the kind of person who was impossible to ignore. Not because she was loud or showy, but because she had this quality about her that I can only describe as settled. Even as a 9-year-old, Destiny seemed settled in herself in a way that most children are not. She was not the most popular girl in class. She was not the one who had the most friends or the newest shoes or the loudest personality. But there was something about her that made you want to be near her. A steadiness, a warmth. She was just one of those people. We became friends gradually. The way children make friends, sitting near each other, working on projects together, talking at recess. And one of the things I noticed about Destiny early on, one of the first things that made her slightly different from my other friends, was that she talked about her family in a way that made them sound like people I wanted to meet. Not because they were glamorous or unusual, but because the way she described ordinary moments in her house made those moments sound full of something. She would talk about Sunday mornings at her house, and her whole face would change. She would talk about her grandmother cooking and everyone sitting around the table, and her father leading a prayer before they ate. And the way she talked about it was not like a child reciting something they had been told was important. It was like she was telling you about something she genuinely loved, something that was one of the best parts of her week. I paid attention to that. I paid attention because I had something similar in my own home, those Ramadan evenings I told you about, where there was warmth and connection round the table. And I recognized the quality of what Destiny was describing because I had tasted something like it. But there was also something in her description that felt slightly different from my own experience, something I could not immediately identify. There was a lightness in how she talked about it, not lightness in the sense of it not being serious, but lightness in the sense of joy, pure joy, like going to church on Sunday was not a duty she performed, but a gift she received. And I remember turning that observation over in my mind because it was interesting to me. Because duty and gift are not the same thing, even when they look the same from the outside. Destiny was also the first person who ever talked to me about Jesus in a personal way. Not in a classroom way, not in the way a textbook mentions Jesus as a historical figure. In a personal way, the way you talk about someone you actually know. She mentioned him in normal conversation sometimes, the way you would mention someone who had done something kind for your family. And it always caught my attention because of how natural it sounded coming from her. It was not performed. It was not like she was trying to teach me something. She was just talking about her life, and Jesus was in her life, the way a real person is in a life, present, connected to things that happened, connected to how she felt about things. I did not ask her a lot of questions about it in those early days. I mostly listened. I was curious, but I was also careful because I already understood by that age that faith was a sensitive topic. I knew my parents had clear feelings about what our family believed, and I was not trying to go somewhere I was not supposed to go. I was just listening, absorbing, filing things away. The first time I went to Destiny's house was sometime in 4th grade. We had become real friends by Then, the kind of friends who called each other and did homework together and told each other things they did not tell other people. Her mother had called my mother and they had a proper conversation about it. And my mother, after meeting Destiny a couple of times at school pickup and deciding she liked her, said yes. I could go for a Saturday afternoon. Destiny lived about 15 minutes from us, in a part of Columbus that was mostly black families, some of whom had been in that neighborhood for generations. Her house was not a large house, but it was full. Her mother, her father, her grandmother, who everyone called Grandma May, her older brother, and her younger sister. The house had things on the walls, pictures and artwork, and in the living room, a cross, a wooden one that was not small. It was probably 30 centimeters tall, hanging on the main wall. Below it was a small framed verse. I could not read it properly from where I was standing because I did not want to stare. But I saw the cross. It was not the first time I had seen a cross. You see crosses everywhere. In America, on buildings, on jewelry, on cars. But seeing it in someone's home like that, as the central thing on the main wall of the living room, as clearly the most important thing in that space, that was different. That made an impression on me. Because in my home, the most important thing on the wall near the front door was the calligraphy in Arabic. It was also a declaration. It was also a statement of what the house was and what the family believed. And seeing Destiny's family's version of that, seeing their declaration on their wall, I felt a recognition. These people are serious about this, I thought. This is not just background noise to them. This is the center. Destiny's mother, Sister Williams, as people called her, was one of the warmest people I had ever met. She welcomed me into that house as if she had been expecting me, not in a strange way, but in the way that genuinely hospitable people make you feel, like your being there was not an imposition but a pleasure. She fed me within 30 minutes of my arrival. She asked me questions about myself and actually listened to my answers. She talked to me like I was a whole person with thoughts worth hearing, even though I was just a kid. And there was something in how that family moved through their house on that Saturday afternoon that I kept noticing and could not stop noticing. There was a peace in that house. A specific kind of peace that is hard to explain. It was not that nothing difficult had ever happened to those people. Even a child could sense that these were people who had navigated hard things, but there was a groundedness, a settledness that underlay everything. Even when the grandmother and the older brother had a disagreement about something during lunch, and things got briefly tense. It resolved quickly and without lasting damage. And underneath the brief tension, the peace was still there. It was structural. It was in the bones of the house. I had peace in my home too, and I want to be clear about that. But what I felt in Destiny's house that day was a specific kind of peace that I had not felt before and could not immediately explain. I went home that evening thoughtful. Not troubled, not confused, just thoughtful, carrying something in my mind that I needed to sit with. Over the next year or so, I spent more time at Destiny's house. Her family became familiar to me. Grandma May, who had this extraordinary way of speaking, that felt like she was always slightly in the middle of a sermon, even when she was just talking about the weather. Destiny's father, who was quiet but who had a presence when he walked into a room, not intimidating, more like the feeling of something solid arriving. And Destiny's mother, who I grew to love in the way you love a person who shows you what genuine goodness looks like when it is not performing for anyone. I observed things in that family that I had not seen before. Not because my family was deficient, but because these things were specific to how their faith expressed itself. The way Destiny's father spoke to her mother, with a consideration and a tenderness that was not sentimental but was clearly purposeful, like he was aware that how he treated her mattered, and he had decided it was going to matter to him to get it right. The way Grandma May prayed, not just before meals, but sometimes in the middle of a conversation, if something came up that seemed to call for it, just naturally. No big announcement, just moving into prayer, the way you move into a different gear. The way the whole family treated hard news or difficult situations, not with denial and not with panic, but with this calm confidence that the situation was not outside of something's control, that there was a framework for it, that they were held. I am telling you about all of this because I want you to understand that what first drew me toward Jesus was not a theological argument. It was not someone sitting me down and explaining to me why Christianity was correct and Islam was wrong. It was nothing like that. What first drew me toward Jesus was seeing what knowing him did to people, what it made them like, what it built in them. I saw it in Destiny. I saw it in her family. And I wanted to understand the source of what I was seeing. That is an important thing, I think. Because a lot of people assume conversion is about being convinced of facts, about one side of an argument winning over another side. And maybe for some people that is how it happens. But for me, it started with something much simpler and much more human than that. It started with looking at a family and thinking, there is something real in there, something I don't have a name for yet, something I want to understand. The first time I heard the story of the crucifixion in real detail, I was at Destiny's house during Easter. I was 9 years old. I had been invited to spend Good Friday afternoon with her family, and Grandma May had decided that she was going to tell the Easter story to the children in the living room. It was not a formal lesson. It was just Grandma May sitting in her chair with me and Destiny's little sister on the floor in front of her, and Grandma May talking. I had heard about Jesus before. I knew his name. I knew from the version I had been taught that he was a prophet and that Christians believed things about him that Muslims did not believe. But I had never heard the full story of Good Friday told by someone who loved him. That is the key thing. I had heard facts. I had not heard the story told by someone to whom it was personal. Grandma May started from the garden, from the night Jesus was in prayer so intense that the sweat came off him like drops of blood, knowing what was coming and asking if there was any other way, and then in the end saying, "Not my will, but yours." She talked about the betrayal. She talked about the trial where they asked him questions to trap him. And he answered with such quiet authority that the people asking the questions did not know what to do with him. She talked about the walk, carrying the weight of the cross through a crowd that was screaming at him. Some of them people who had been fed by his hands not long before. She talked about the nails. I sat very still. I was not moving. I was barely breathing. She talked about the words he said from the cross. She talked about the forgiveness he extended from the cross to the people who had put him there, while he was still hanging on it, not after, not once he was safe, while he was there, while it was still happening. She talked about how he took care of his mother even while he was dying. She talked about the moment when he said it was finished, and then he was gone. And then she talked about what the disciples felt in the days after. The despair of it, the feeling of everything falling apart and nothing making sense and all the hope dying. The heaviness of those 3 days. And then she talked about Sunday morning. I cannot tell you exactly what I felt during that story, I was 9 years old and did not have the emotional vocabulary to categorize what was happening inside me while Grandma May talked. But I can tell you that something happened. Something broke open in the middle of my chest in the way a window breaks open to let in air. Not violently, just suddenly. There is air where before there was stuffiness. Something in me responded to that story in a way that I had not experienced before with any religious story I had been told. What I kept returning to in my head even after that afternoon was over, even after I went home and went through the rest of my day, was the forgiveness from the cross. That detail would not leave me. The idea of someone being hurt to that degree, killed in that way, by people who should have known better, and choosing in the middle of it to forgive. Rather than to curse, choosing in the middle of dying to pray for the people who were making him die. I had been taught about forgiveness. My own faith, tradition spoke about forgiveness. But there was something in this specific image, something in the particular strangeness and beauty of forgiving from a position of total vulnerability and pain that struck me in a way I could not shake. It felt like something I had never encountered before. It felt like a kind of love I did not have a frame for, a love that did not make natural sense, a love that went further than love is supposed to be able to go. I went home that day carrying that image with me, the cross, the words from the cross. And I went into my room and sat on my bed and thought about it for a long time. Something shifted after that Good Friday afternoon. It was not dramatic, it was not sudden, but something in me started leaning more noticeably in a particular direction. I started asking destiny questions. Careful. Questions at first, the way you put your foot on ice to test whether it will hold your weight. Questions about what she believed and why, about what her family believed, about what it actually meant to them in their everyday lives to be Christian. Destiny was a good person to ask these questions to because she was honest without being pushy. She did not seize on my curiosity as an opportunity to convert me. She just answered my questions the way a friend answers a friend's genuine questions. Straightforwardly, personally, without pressure. When she did not know the answer to something, she said she did not know. That honesty made me trust her more. I started noticing Christianity in my environment in a more active way. I had always been aware of it peripherally. The Christmas concerts, the Easter break at school, the crosses on buildings. But now I was looking more intentionally. When we drove past a church on a Sunday morning, and there were people outside talking and the doors were open, I looked. I noticed what church buildings looked like. I noticed the way people dressed when they came out of them. I noticed the signs outside churches with their weekly messages. I started reading those signs. Some of them were ordinary. Some of them said something that made me think. I also started, quietly and privately, wondering about Jesus in a more personal way. Not as a historical figure, not as a subject to be studied, but as a person. Who was he really? Not what did Christians believe about him in theory, but who was he? What did he actually do and say? What was he actually like? I was curious about him the way you are curious about someone you have heard about from multiple people and you want to meet for yourself instead of relying on second-hand accounts. I did not act on that curiosity right away. It lived inside me for a while, growing quietly without my feeding it deliberately. I was still the same girl I had always been. I was still going through the Ramadan rituals with my family. I was still praying in the way I had been taught. I was still Amira, the daughter of Tariq and Nadia Hassan. the girl who came from a Muslim home and was proud of her heritage. I was not doing anything about the thing growing in me because I did not know what to do about it, and because part of me was afraid of what doing something about it would mean, but I could feel it. That is the thing. I could feel it growing, the way you can feel a plant growing even when you cannot see it moving. Something was coming up from the ground in me. Something had been planted, and it was alive, and it was moving upward, and I was going to have to deal with it eventually. I did not know then that it was going to change everything. I did not know that by the time I was 11 years old, the entirety of my family's life was going to look different. I did not know that my father, the man who stopped everything 5 times a day to face Mecca and pray, was going to one day stand in a church and give his life to Jesus Christ. I did not know any of that was coming. But the seed had been planted, the ground had been prepared, and something in me had already decided, even if my mind had not consciously caught up yet, that I was going to follow this wherever it led. There is one more thing I want to say about this period of my life, about these early years of growing curiosity and quiet observation, before I move into what actually happened next. I want to say something about the quality of what I was feeling, because I think it matters. I was not feeling rebellious. I was not trying to reject my parents or my culture or my heritage. I was not a confused kid trying to fit in with American culture by adopting the religion of my classmates. That is what some people might assume, and I understand why they might assume it, but it was not true. I was not running away from something. I was being pulled towards something. And those two things feel completely different from the inside. Running away comes from pain. Running away comes from rejection and wanting to escape. What I was experiencing was not escape. It was attraction. It was the way you feel when something you have always been looking for, without knowing you were looking for it, starts to come into focus. The closer it gets, the more you recognize it. And the recognition feels like remembering something you had somehow forgotten, even though you are sure you have never known it before. It feels like home in a place you have never been. That is what finding Jesus felt like to me. And it started here in these early years, in a classroom in Columbus, in a house that smelled like cooking and had a cross on the main wall, in the living room of a grandmother who loved him and was not ashamed to say so. It started with Destiny. It started with her family. It started with a story about a Friday afternoon 2,000 years ago and a man who forgave from a cross. That is where it started. I want to tell you about the first time I held a Bible. I was 10 years old. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was at Destiny's house after school. We had been doing homework at the kitchen table, and at some point Destiny had gotten up to get us something to drink, and I was sitting there alone at the table, and there was a Bible on the counter nearby, not hidden, not displayed dramatically, just sitting there the way a book sits in a house, where it belongs naturally, like it had always been there and would always be there. It was well used. The cover was slightly worn at the corners. There were pages that had things underlined in them. Someone had loved this book. You could tell by looking at it that someone had spent real time with it. I reached over and picked it up. I did not have a plan. I was not making a decision. I just picked it up the way you pick up something that is within reach when your hands are idle. I held it for a moment. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it to a random page somewhere in the middle, and the words I saw were from the book of Psalms, though I did not know at the time that it was called Psalms. I read a few lines. They were about God being a shelter, about finding refuge under God's protection, about not being afraid. The language was plain and direct, and the feeling behind the words was immediate. The way certain music reaches you before your mind has caught up with the notes. I read a bit more. I turned a few pages. I was not reading carefully or systematically. I was just grazing, moving through it, the way you move through something new that you are trying to get a feel for. And then Destiny came back into the kitchen and saw me with it, and she did not make it strange. She just sat down and said something like, "Do you want to read it properly sometime? I can show you where to start." I said yes, before I had fully thought about whether I meant it. She showed me the Gospel of John. She said her Sunday school teacher had told her that if someone wanted to understand who Jesus was, John was the place to start. She found the first chapter and handed the Bible back to me. I read the opening lines right there at the kitchen table. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I did not fully understand what that meant, but something about those lines arrested me. There was a weight in them, a density, like they were carrying more than they appeared to be carrying on the surface. Like if you pressed on them, more would come out. I asked Destiny if I could borrow the Bible to take home. She looked at me for a moment, and I could see her thinking, not calculating or scheming, just thinking, processing what I was asking in the context of knowing me and knowing my family. And then she said she thought it might be better if we read it together here, at her house. She was not being unkind. She was being practical, in the way that only a true friend can be practical about your situation, without making you feel small for it. She understood that my home was not a place where a Bible appearing in my bag was going to be a neutral event. She was protecting me. So that became our arrangement. A few times a week when I came to her house after school, we would sit together and read. She would explain things she knew. When neither of us understood something, sometimes her mother would explain, or Grandma May, who seemed to know the Bible the way she knew her own address, with no effort, completely from memory and familiarity. I read slowly. I was not rushing. Every few verses, I would have to stop and sit with what I had just read, because the reading kept doing something to me, and I needed to let it do what it was doing before I moved forward. The Gospel of John was not like anything I had read before. The way Jesus spoke in it, the way he engaged with people, the woman at the well, the man who had been blind from birth. The way Jesus walked into those stories was not the way a distant authority figure walks into situations. He was immediate. He was present. He noticed people. He addressed what was actually wrong, not what was ostensibly wrong. When the woman at the well came to draw water, he did not talk to her about water. He talked to her about her life, about the specific shape of her particular loneliness. And he did it without judgment, which was the thing that kept stopping me cold. Without judgment, over and over in those stories. He encountered people who, by the standards of his own society and his own religion, were people you were supposed to avoid or condemn, or at minimum, keep at a careful distance. And he did not do any of those things. He walked straight toward them. He touched people that the religious rules said you were not supposed to touch. He ate with people that proper religious society did not eat with. And in every single case, the people he walked toward were changed by it. Something happened to them in the encounter with him that did not happen in any other encounter in their lives. I kept reading. I could not stop reading. Even when I was not at Destiny's house, I was thinking about what I had read last and anticipating what I would read next. I was thinking about the stories during school. I was thinking about them at the dinner table with my family. The stories were alive in my head in a way that was different from how I had experienced religious stories before. They were not static, they moved, they breathed. They had details in them that made them feel like things that had actually happened to real people in a real place. The way John remembered the number of water pots at the wedding in Cana. The way he remembered that it was cold that night when Peter was warming himself by the fire. These were the details of someone who was there and could not forget what they saw. It was during this period of reading that I reached the crucifixion in John's account. I had heard it from Grandma May the year before. But reading it for myself was different. Reading it slowly, following it step by step through John's eyes, was different. There was something about the pacing of it, the way it took as long as it took. The way John did not rush through the hard parts. The way he recorded what Jesus said from the cross, including the moment when he looked down at his mother standing there, watching him die, and he made arrangement for someone to take care of her. He was on the cross, and he looked at his mother, and he was thinking about who was going to look after her after he was gone. I had to stop reading at that point. I sat with that image for a long time, and then I read the resurrection. I do not know how to explain to you what happened when I read the resurrection. I do not have precise language for it. I had heard that Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. I knew that this was the central claim of the faith. But knowing it as information and reading it in the account of someone who was there, who walked into that tomb and saw it empty, who touched the folded cloths and processed the confusion of what that meant, and then the encounters, Mary in the garden thinking he was the gardener until he said her name, the disciples behind locked doors, and suddenly he was there in the room with them. Thomas, the one who said he would not believe unless he touched the wounds himself. And then Jesus appearing specifically for Thomas and offering him exactly that. Touch, see, believe. Something happened in my chest when I read those resurrection accounts. Something that I can only describe as a door opening. Not a metaphorical door, I physically felt something open, some interior space that had been closed or perhaps had never been opened before, and air came into it. And along with the air came something else. Came a certainty, not a reasoned certainty, not a conclusion arrived at through logic. A felt certainty, the kind that lives in the body and not in the head. The kind that does not need an argument because it comes from a different place than arguments come from. I thought this is real. I thought this actually happened. I thought this man is not dead. I was 10 years old sitting in my friend's kitchen, and I was certain with my whole body that Jesus Christ was not dead, that he was real, that the resurrection was not a story invented by desperate people who needed comfort. It was an event. It was the most important event in human history, and nobody had made me believe it. No argument had convinced me. No preacher had won me over. I had just read it, and something in me had recognized it the way you recognize the truth. Not because someone told you it was true, but because some part of you already knew and was simply waiting for the confirmation. I sat there for probably 10 minutes without moving. Destiny had left the kitchen to do something, and I was alone with what had just happened in me. And in that 10 minutes, something settled. Something landed. I was not confused, I was not frightened, I was not in conflict. Everything was very quiet inside me in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. It felt like the quiet after something very important has been said, and everyone in the room is sitting with the weight of it. I knew in that moment, sitting at that kitchen table at 10 years old, that I believed in Jesus. Not just believed things about him. Believed in him. Believed he was who John said he was. Believed he was real and present and not finished. I had not gone to church yet. I had not said a formal prayer of commitment. I had not talked to a pastor or a counselor or anyone official. I had just read a book that had been sitting on a counter, and Jesus had found me in it. That is my testimony. That is the center of it. Everything else, the church, the formal decision, the family transformation, all of that came later and all of it matters. But the real thing, the thing that happened first, the thing that nothing can take away, happened at a kitchen table with a borrowed Bible and no one else in the room. It happened quietly. It happened personally. It happened in the way I believe God does many of the most important things, in the small, still moments that nobody sees coming. After that day, everything in me intensified. I needed to know more. I needed to understand more. I started asking Destiny and her family more direct questions, not gentle, probing questions anymore, but real questions. Theological questions that a 10-year-old should not have been thinking about but was. I asked about the Trinity because that was the thing that confused me most. The idea of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which seemed to contradict the most fundamental thing I had been raised on, which was that God was one, indivisible without partners. I asked about what happened when Jesus was on the cross, what it meant, why it was necessary, what exactly was accomplished. I asked about the Holy Spirit, about what the Holy Spirit actually was and how it worked. Destiny's mother, Sister Williams, started having these conversations with me seriously. She sat with me on several occasions and walked through things carefully and patiently. She was not preaching at me. She was explaining to someone who genuinely wanted to understand. She recommended that I read the book of Romans because she said it explained in the clearest way what the cross was about, what it accomplished, why it was necessary. So I did. I read Romans slowly, going back over sections, asking about what I did not understand. And the more I understood, the more the whole thing cohered into something I could not find, a reason to refuse, not intellectually, not emotionally, not spiritually. The story made sense in a way that went beyond logic. It made sense in the deepest part of me. The idea that the distance between God and humanity was a real problem that needed a real solution. The idea that the solution could not come from human effort because the problem was larger than human effort could address. The idea that God himself came into the problem and absorbed its consequences in order to resolve it. The idea that the cross was not a tragedy but a purpose. Not a defeat but an act of the most precise and determined love imaginable. I thought about that God I had felt in my sick bed at 8 years old. The close God, the warm presence, and suddenly I had a name for it. Suddenly I understood who that was. Suddenly everything that had been just out of reach in my understanding of God clicked into place with a clarity that made me want to cry. Not from sadness, from recognition, from relief, from the feeling of something finally making sense that you have been trying to understand for years. Then the dream started. I do not talk about this part of my story often because I know that people hear, "I had a dream," and they think you are either making it up for dramatic effect or you are someone who puts too much weight on their subconscious. I am not asking you to take this as theological evidence. I am just telling you what happened to me. I am telling you my experience, and my experience included a dream that I have never been able to dismiss or explain away. And it happened when I was 10 years old, and I still remember every detail of it. I dreamed that I was in a place that was very bright. Not uncomfortably bright, not like staring into a light, but suffused with brightness. The way a room is bright on a clear morning, when the curtains are open and the sun is at the right angle. I was standing in this bright place, and I was aware that someone was nearby. I could not see them clearly at first. The brightness was not obscuring them exactly. It was more like the brightness was coming from them, and my eyes were adjusting. And then I saw him. I cannot tell you how I knew it was him. I just knew. The way in a dream you know things without being told them. He was not the way he is depicted in the paintings, the long pale face and the distant expression. He was present, he was warm. There was something about his face that I cannot describe adequately, except to say that looking at it felt like being known completely and being loved completely at the same time. And those two things, being fully known and being fully loved, happened simultaneously. And that combination was more overwhelming than anything I had ever felt in waking life. He did not say many words to me. What he said was essentially, "I have been looking for you. Come." That was it. That was the dream. I woke up from it, and I was not frightened. I was not disturbed. I was crying, but not from sadness. I was crying from the same feeling I had experienced at Destiny's kitchen table, but amplified. The relief, the recognition, the feeling of a door that had been shut for a long time standing open. I lay in my bed in the dark of my room in my Muslim family's house in Columbus, Ohio, and I said quietly, just my lips moving, not making sound, "Okay, I'm here, I'm coming." I was 10 years old. The weeks after that dream were some of the most complicated I had experienced up to that point in my life. Because here is the thing about being a child, you are not independent. You do not live your own life. You live inside your family's life, inside their decisions and their structures and their beliefs. And I was starting to have a reality inside me that was growing every day, and that had almost nothing to do with the reality I was living outwardly at home as the daughter of Tariq and Nadia Hassan. I was still doing everything I was supposed to do at home. When Ramadan came, I fasted the days my mother asked me to fast. When it was prayer time, I observed it. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had changed, and that gap between my inner reality and my outer reality was becoming harder to sustain. Not because I was being dishonest exactly, but because when something is real and large and living in you, containing it is exhausting. It presses against the walls, it wants out. I told Destiny. I told her one afternoon on the way home from school, walking the few blocks we walked together before going our separate ways. I told her that I thought I believed in Jesus. I told her about the kitchen table moments. I told her about the dream. I did not tell her everything, the full depth of what I had been carrying, because I did not have the language for all of it yet. But I told her the essential thing. I believed. Something had happened in me. I was different from what I had been. She stopped walking when I said it. She turned and looked at me, and her face did something I was not prepared for. She looked for just a moment like she was going to cry, and then she pulled me into a hug, which was unusual because we were not particularly a hugging kind of friendship. And she held on for a few seconds and then stepped back and looked at me with that settled quality I had always admired in her, and she said simply, "I knew it. I prayed for you. I have been praying for you for a long time." I did not know what to say to that. The idea that someone had been praying for me specifically, bringing my name to Jesus in their private prayers, was both touching and slightly overwhelming. I had been found by something, but I was also beginning to understand that this finding had not been accidental. Someone had been asking for it. The first Sunday I went to church was a few weeks after that conversation with Destiny. My parents knew I was going. I had told my mother that I wanted to go with Destiny's family to their church. I had been careful about how I presented it. I told her I was curious. I told her it was important to understand different faiths. I did not lie, but I was not telling her the full truth either. My mother had looked at me for a long moment when I asked, the way she sometimes looked at me when she was trying to read past what I was saying to what I was not saying. And then she had said one time, and she wanted to speak with Destiny's mother first. Sister Williams and my mother had a phone conversation. I do not know exactly what was said, but my mother came to me afterward and said I could go. Destiny's family's church was a mid-sized black church in their neighborhood. When we arrived on that Sunday morning, the parking lot was already full and people were everywhere, dressed up, greeting each other with genuine warmth, children running, older people moving slowly and deliberately toward the entrance. The sound coming from inside the building was already music, not background music, but full music, voices and instruments together. And even from outside, it was something you could feel in your chest as well as hear with your ears. I walked in and I was not prepared for any of it. I had been in quiet, formal spaces of worship before. The mosque my father took us to was not silent, but it was ordered. There was a structure and a formality that was the container for everything that happened there. What I walked into at that church was something different. It was not chaos. There was structure, there was order, but the order was alive in a way I had not seen in a place of worship before. The music was happening and people were engaged with it, not passively listening, but actively participating. Some of them with their eyes closed and their hands raised, some of them with tears on their faces, some of them with expressions of what I can only describe as joy taken to its highest degree. I sat next to Destiny and I did not know what to do with my hands. I did not know when to stand. I followed her lead and stood when she stood and sat when she sat. The songs washed over me. Some of them I had never heard before. One of them was about the blood of Jesus, about what it meant, and the congregation sang it with an intensity that made it clear this was not an abstract thing they were singing about. It was personal. It was the most important thing. It was the thing on which everything else rested. The pastor preached about grace, about the unearned, undeserved, non-negotiable love of God that comes toward people, not because of what they have done, but because of who God is. He was not yelling, though his voice rose and fell with the material, in a way that I had never experienced in a sermon before. He was talking about something he had clearly thought about deeply, and felt even more deeply. And the congregation responded, not just in the formal ways. People said things, people confirmed things back to him. There was a conversation happening between the preacher and the people that was alive and not scripted and completely genuine. I sat there for the entire service in a state I cannot fully describe. Something was happening to my body that was outside my control. My eyes were filling with tears at different points, and I was not making them do that. My chest was tight, and then releasing, and then tight again. I was not performing emotion. I was experiencing it. Something in that room, the music, the words, the presence of hundreds of people who believed what I had come to believe, gathered in one place To worship the same Jesus I had encountered at a kitchen table was activating something in me that had no off switch. At the end of the service, the pastor gave an invitation. He asked if there was anyone who wanted to give their life to Jesus Christ, who wanted to accept the grace that had been preached about, who wanted to begin a relationship with the living God. He asked people to come forward. I did not go forward that Sunday. I was not ready. And I also knew that going forward in a church service was not a small thing. It was not a private decision made in a kitchen. It was a public declaration. And I was not yet ready to make that declaration. Not because I doubted what I felt, but because I understood, even at 10 years old, that what came after that declaration was going to be complicated in ways I was not yet equipped to navigate. But I sat there while others went forward, and I watched, and I knew that I was going to be up there eventually. I knew that the decision had already been made inside me. It was only a matter of time before the inside and the outside matched. I went home from that church service changed, not visibly changed, not in a way my parents could see, but changed in the way your insides can change completely while your outside stays exactly the same. I went home and ate lunch with my family and answered their questions about what the church was like, with careful, partial answers. And then I went to my room and sat on my bed and did something I had never done before. I prayed to Jesus. Not a formal prayer, not a constructed prayer, just direct speech in my head to him. I said something close to, "I think I know who you are now. I think I have known for a while. I am not ready yet to do this in front of everyone. But I wanted you to know that I know, and I believe, and I am yours. I am just still figuring out how to make everything match up." It was the simplest, most unadorned prayer I have ever prayed. No flowery language, no religious vocabulary, just a 10-year-old girl telling Jesus that she had found him, or that he had found her, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise, even if only the two of them knew it for now. The quiet that came after that prayer was the same quiet I had felt at the kitchen table, the same peace, the same deep settled warmth that did not come from anything in the room or anything in my circumstances. It came from somewhere outside of me, and it came in through something that had opened in me, and it stayed. It did not go away when I got up and went back to my regular day. That peace, quiet, personal, impossible to manufacture, impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it, was the thing I would hold on to in the hard months that followed, when everything got complicated, when my parents found out, when the cost of this became real. But I am getting ahead of myself again. That is for the next part. For now, the most important thing I want you to take from this part of my story is this. Jesus found me in a book. He found me in the details of stories that are 2,000 years old. He found me in a dream. He found me in a church service where I did not know anyone and did not know the songs and did not know the customs. He found me over and over again in different ways through different doors, and every single time I recognized him. Not because someone told me to recognize him, not because someone convinced me he was real, because something in me already knew, and every new encounter with him was just another confirmation of something that had already been settled at a level deeper than my conscious mind. I was 10 years old. I was a Muslim girl from a Muslim home, and I had met Jesus. And nothing was ever going to be the same. There is a particular kind of weight that comes with carrying a secret that is not really a secret. It is just a truth you have not yet found the courage to say out loud. I carried that weight for almost a year, From the time I was 10 and that quiet revolution happened inside me, through the months that followed into my 11th year. All of that time I was living what felt like two lives. Not in a dishonest way, not in the way of someone who is deliberately deceiving the people they love, but in the way of someone who has become something new while the people around them still know them as what they used to be. The gap between who I was and how I was being perceived was growing every day, and the growing was not comfortable. During that year, my faith deepened in private. I was reading more. Destiny and her family were my main source of teaching and community. I had attended church with them several more times. My mother had stopped asking many questions about my visits to Destiny's house, perhaps because nothing alarming seemed to be happening on the surface. I was still a good student. I was still respectful at home. I was still the Amira they knew in all the ways they could observe. But the Amira they could not observe had been transformed, and the transformation was complete enough that it was no longer something I could manage alone. I prayed constantly during that year. Not formal prayers, but this running conversation with Jesus. That became the most natural thing in my life, more natural than anything else. I talked to him the way you talk to the person you trust most in the world. I told him everything, my fears about what was coming, my love for my parents, my confusion about how this was all going to work, my questions about things I did not understand. And the peace kept coming. Not the absence of difficulty or anxiety, but underneath the difficulty and the anxiety always. The groundedness. The knowing that I was held. I tried many times to imagine how telling my parents would go. I played through the conversations in my mind at night, when I should have been sleeping. I thought about my mother first because she was easier to approach, not because her faith was less serious, but because she was softer in her manner of responding to things. I thought about my father, and that was harder to sit with. My father's faith was not performative. It was structural. It was the architecture of who he was. His identity as a Muslim was not separable from his identity as a Jordanian, as a father, as a man who had built his life in a foreign country and kept his roots intact through discipline and devotion. What I was going to tell him was not going to feel like a small religious adjustment. It was going to feel like a severing. I knew that. I went over it in my mind many times. And I want to be honest, I was afraid. I was genuinely, thoroughly afraid. Not of my parents hurting me because they were never that kind of parents, but afraid of hurting them. Afraid of the grief on my father's face. Afraid of what I was going to do to my mother's heart. Afraid of the disappointment and the confusion and the conversations I did not know how to have. I was 11 years old and I was carrying the weight of a decision whose consequences stretched far beyond me. What finally broke the thing open was not a dramatic moment. It was accumulation. It was simply that the gap had gotten too large to maintain. I had reached the point where continuing to live in the gap was costing me more than the fear of closing it. I could not go to church and come home and sit at the dinner table during Ramadan and participate in the rituals as though nothing had changed and still sleep at night. Not because the rituals were painful, they were not painful, but because they required a level of performance that was becoming incompatible with who I actually was. I was not a Muslim girl going through the motions while secretly being Christian. I was a Christian girl who had not yet told the people who loved her most, and I could not be that person anymore. I told my mother on a Saturday morning in spring, a few weeks after my 11th birthday. My father had gone out. My brother was at a friend's house. It was just two of us at home. which felt either like perfect timing or the worst timing. I could not tell. My mother was in the kitchen, and I came and sat at the kitchen table again. It seems like all the important things in my story happen at kitchen tables. And I sat there for a few minutes just watching her move around the kitchen. She was warm and ordinary, and she was my mother, the person who had sat beside my sick bed and taught me Arabic letters and made chicken and rice that smelled like belonging. I told her I needed to talk to her about something important. She turned around and looked at me, and she already knew. I could see it in her face. The way a mother's face shifts when she realizes something real is coming. She dried her hands on a towel, and she sat down across from me at the table. I told her I did not dress it up. I did not soften it into something it was not. I told her that over the past year and a half, something had happened to me. I told her about reading the Bible. I told her about what I had felt. I told her, as directly as I could, that I believed Jesus was who Christians said he was, that he was the Son of God, that he had died and risen, and that I had given my heart to him. I told her I was not telling her this to hurt her. I was telling her because she was my mother, and I could not keep it from her anymore, and it would have been wrong to try. She did not say anything for a long time after I finished. She sat there very still and looked at the table. I watched her face. I watched things move through her face that I did not have names for. Not rage, not the explosion I had half prepared myself for. Something more complicated than rage. A grief, a confusion, a kind of searching look, like she was trying to find the place in her understanding of her own child where this information was supposed to fit, and it was not fitting anywhere she could locate. She asked me if I was sure, not argumentatively, just quietly, as if she needed to confirm that this was not a phase or a fascination, but something real. I told her I was sure. I told her I had been sure for a long time. She got up from the table and went to stand at the sink with her back to me. She was there for a while. Not long, maybe a few minutes, but it felt longer. And then she turned around, and her eyes were wet, and she said something that I did not expect. She said she needed time. She said she needed to pray and think. She said she was not going to pretend this was easy, but she also said she loved me. She said that clearly. No matter what, she loved me. I started crying when she said that. The release of a year of carrying something alone, and then the relief of hearing my mother say she loved me on the other side of the truth, undid something in me, and I cried for a while at that kitchen table. And my mother came and put her hand on my head, the way she used to do when I was very small, and she stood there beside me while I cried without saying much. That was my mother. That was the first conversation. My father was harder. He found out that same evening because my mother told him. She felt she had to. This was not the kind of thing you could keep from your husband. She told him when he came home, and my brother and I were in our rooms. I did not hear the conversation they had. But later that evening, my father came to my room and knocked on the door and came in and sat on the edge of my desk chair. He looked exhausted in a way that was different from work tired. He looked tired in his spirit. And looking at him sitting there in my room, that man who had built everything from nothing, who had faced every difficult thing in his life with his faith as his foundation. Looking at how he looked in that moment, that was the hardest part of this whole story for me, harder than anything that came after, because I had done that to him. My truth had walked into my father's life and tired him in his spirit, and I was 11 years old, and there was nothing I could do about it. He asked me questions, not angry questions. He was not a man who became loud when he was in pain. He became very still and very precise. He wanted to understand. He asked me how this had happened. He asked me who had been influencing me. He asked me if I understood what I was saying, what I was claiming to believe. He asked me if I understood the weight of it. I answered him as honestly and as completely as I could. I told him about destiny. I told him about the reading. I told him about what had happened inside me and that it had not been the result of pressure from anyone. I told him I was not abandoning him or our family. I was not rejecting our heritage. I had found something, or something had found me, and I believed it with everything in me, and I could not pretend otherwise. He listened to everything, and when I was done, he sat there quietly for a while, and then he said something that stayed with me for a long time. He said that he had raised me to be an honest person, and he could see that I was being honest, and he respected that, but that he needed me to understand that this was not a small thing for him. He said his faith was not a costume. It was the thing he had built his life on, and what I was telling him felt like the ground moving under him. He did not shout. He did not threaten me. He did not say he was cutting me off, or that I was no longer his daughter. But he left my room that night, and the house felt different. There was a distance in him, a grief, a quiet that was not peaceful, and that quiet settled over our family for weeks. Those weeks were the hardest of my life. My father was not cruel. He was never cruel, but he was distant in a way he had never been before. He was present in the house, but somewhere else at the same time. He still asked about school. He still provided for us. But the warmth that was usually so available in him, that particular fatherly warmth that I had grown up inside of, had withdrawn somewhere I could not reach. He was processing, I understood that. But understanding something does not stop it from hurting. My mother was more openly struggling, but also more openly present with me through it. She would ask me questions sometimes, not confrontational questions, but genuine ones. She was reading things, she was thinking. I could tell she was doing the work of someone who was trying to understand something they had never considered before. She was not there yet, not by a long way, but she was engaged with the question in a way my father was not yet ready to be. My brother was only 9 and did not fully understand what was happening, except that there was tension in the house that had not been there before, and it had something to do with me. He was confused and occasionally sulky in the way younger siblings are sulky when they sense that something important is happening that they are not being included in. I kept praying through all of this. I kept talking to Jesus through all of it. I told him in those private conversations that nobody could see, that I needed him to do something. Not for me, for my parents. I told him that my parents were good people. I told him that my father loved God. I told him that whatever the distance between them and what I now believed, they were sincere. They were not pretenders. They were not people going through religious motions for social reasons. They genuinely loved and sought God. I asked Jesus to let them see him. I asked him to do whatever he needed to do in their lives, to show himself to them the way he had shown himself to me. I prayed that prayer many times, every single day through those hard weeks, sometimes several times a day. It was not a sophisticated prayer. It was not eloquent. It was a child asking for her parents. But I believed then, and I believe even more now, that it was heard. What changed my mother's heart happened about 6 weeks after that first conversation. She had been having her own private interior journey that I was only aware of in pieces. She later told me some of it after everything changed, and I am going to share what she shared with me because I think it matters. She had started reading on her own without me asking her to, without Destiny's family or anyone else prompting her. She had found things online at first, things about Christianity, about Jesus, trying to understand from the outside what it was that her daughter had found inside this faith. And then she had picked up a Bible herself, not to be converted, to understand, because she was the kind of woman who needed to understand things properly, not just react to them. She read some of the same things I had read, the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus, and she later told me that what she encountered was not what she had expected. What she expected, I think, was something she could locate a clear objection to, something she could bring back to me and say, look, you see, here is where this falls apart. What she found instead was something that would not cooperate with that plan. She found Jesus himself in the pages of the Gospels, and he was not cooperating with her objections either. There was a specific evening she told me about. She was reading late at night after everyone had gone to bed, reading the Gospel of Luke, and she got to the story of the prodigal son. She had heard this story referenced before in her life, but she had never read it in its full version, in its proper context. In one sitting, she read it. She read about the younger son who takes his inheritance early and goes and wastes it on everything wrong and ends up destitute and feeding pigs, and finally comes to his senses and decides to go home and ask his father to make him a servant because he no longer deserves to be called a son. And she read what happens when he is still a long way off. The father sees him coming and runs towards him. She told me she had to put the book down when she read that. She told me she sat in the kitchen, alone in the quiet house, and something broke open in her that she had not seen coming. The image of the father running, not waiting, not setting conditions, not dignifying the son's return with a measured, proportionate response, but running at a full run towards someone who had done nothing to deserve that level of joy at their return. She told me that she sat in the kitchen for a long time with that image, and at some point, not fully understanding what she was doing, she began to pray. Not to Allah with the familiar form and the Arabic words, not in the way she had always prayed. She prayed toward Jesus. She prayed the way you pray when all your frameworks have shifted and you are reaching for something true without being certain what it looks like yet. She prayed, essentially, show me if this is real. Show me if you are who they say you are. She told me she went to bed that night different from how she had gotten up that morning. She did not fully understand what was happening yet. She did not have the language for it, but something had moved. Something had shifted at the foundation level. The ground that my revelation had disrupted was reforming into something else. And she was in the middle of the reforming. She started talking to me differently after that. Not as a concerned mother monitoring a child's religious confusion. More like a person walking alongside another person on the same road. She asked me to tell her more about what I believed. She asked me to explain the things that had been most real to me. She was not ready to call herself a Christian, but she was asking. And in my experience, when you are genuinely asking about Jesus, he does not let you keep asking forever without answering. My father's journey was slower and quieter and entirely private. I did not see it happening in real time the way I saw it with my mother. My father was not a man who showed his process. He internalized things, worked through them in the deep interior of himself, and only shared what he had concluded. What I experienced from him was simply the gradual return of warmth, the slow coming back of the availability that had withdrawn. It was subtle at first, small moments, sitting with me in the evening when he had been avoiding those quiet times before, looking at me across the dinner table with something in his eyes that was not quite the old familiar look, but was moving toward it. He later told me, months after everything had changed, what his journey had been like. I want to share it because I think it is the part of this whole story that moves me the most. He told me that after our conversation in my room, he had gone into a crisis of faith that he had not experienced since he was a young man first arriving in America. He told me that what I had said, not my conversion itself, but the specific things I had said about who Jesus was, had lodged in him like something he could not get out. He told me he was not a man who had ever given serious theological consideration to Christianity. He had known it as the other thing, the faith of his Western neighbors, the faith that was different from his own in the specific way that mattered most, in how it understood Jesus. He had never examined it from the inside, but now his daughter was inside it, and he found that he could not dismiss what she had said, not because she was persuasive in a sophisticated way, but because he knew his daughter, and he could see in her, had been able to see for months before she told him, a quality of something that he recognized as real. He had been watching it without knowing what he was watching. The peace in her, the groundedness, the way she prayed, and he had heard her praying in her room sometimes, without knowing who she was praying to, and the quality of that prayer was something he had prized above almost everything in his own faith life. It was real. He could not say it was not real. He told me he started reading. He got a Bible and he read it privately, not telling my mother or anyone else. He read it the way an engineer reads something, looking for the structural logic, looking for what held it up, looking for where it failed. He told me he was looking for the place where it fell apart. He told me he read for weeks looking for that place. He never found it. What he found instead was Jesus, the same Jesus my mother had found in her kitchen late at night. The same Jesus I had found at a kitchen table with a borrowed Bible. He found a person in those pages who would not be diminished or explained away. He found a teacher whose teaching was unlike anything he had encountered, not in its wisdom only, which was considerable, but in its direction. Everything this man taught pointed away from himself and toward the people he was teaching. Everything he did was in the direction of the least, the last, the lost. He had no self-preservation instinct in any of the stories. He had no agenda except love. He had no destination except the cross. My father, who had spent his whole adult life working to build something, who had measured everything by the logic of effort and outcome, who had ordered his spiritual life around discipline and submission to a God he was certain was real and good but distant, found a God who ran toward returning sons. And something in him that had been ordered around distance and effort and worthiness encountered the idea that the worthiness was not the point, that the love came first, and the worthiness was something the love itself was creating. And this broke something open in my father that he had not expected to have opened. He came to me one evening about 3 months after that first hard night in my room. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and he asked me to tell him about my faith, not to interrogate it, not to test it. He asked the way you ask when you are genuinely, humbly seeking something. He asked the way my mother had started asking. And I told him everything from the beginning. The reading, the kitchen table moment, the dream, the church, the peace that did not make sense but would not go away. I told him for a long time and he listened for all of it. And when I was done, he was quiet for a while. And then he said that he wanted to come to church. I will never forget those words for the rest of my life. My father, Tariq Hassan, the man who had built his life on the prayers of Islam and the identity of his heritage, telling his 11-year-old daughter that he wanted to come to church. It was one of the most extraordinary moments I have ever experienced, and I have experienced some extraordinary moments. The Sunday we all went to church together for the first time, me, my mother, my father, and my brother, was one of those days that you know while it is happening will stay with you forever. We went to Destiny's church. Sister Williams had been told we were coming, and she met us outside with the kind of grace that made my parents feel welcomed without feeling pitied. She introduced us to people without making us feel like a project. She sat with us in the service. I watched my parents during that service. I could not help watching them. My father sat very still and very attentive the way he sat during things he considered serious. He listened to the music, he listened to the sermon. His face was unreadable, in the way his face could be unreadable when he was processing something deeply. My mother had tears from very early in the service, and she was not trying to stop them. The pastor preached about the love of God, about a love that is not earned and cannot be lost, about a love that went to the ultimate length so that no one would have to stand before God on the basis of what they had done or failed to do, because the accounting had already been settled by someone else on behalf of everyone who would receive it. When the invitation came at the end of the service, I did not go forward. I watched. My mother went forward. She walked to the front of that church with tears running down her face, and she gave her life to Jesus Christ. Watching my mother give her life to Jesus was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. It was so full of courage. She was not a young, confused person with nothing to lose. She was a grown woman with a heritage and a community and a faith she had held her whole life, and she walked toward Jesus anyway. And then my father went forward. My father stood up from that pew and walked to the front of the church. And the moment he went, something happened in that building. I do not know how to explain it. The atmosphere shifted. Some of the church members around us, people who had seen us arrive as strangers and had no context for who we were, began to cry. Sister Williams was crying. Destiny was gripping my hand so hard it almost hurt. My father stood at the front of that church and he prayed the prayer. He prayed it in English, and I know he was praying it in his heart in Arabic simultaneously, because that was who he was. He prayed it out loud, and he meant every word. I could see from where I sat that he meant every word. I went forward then. I could not stay in my seat. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Without knowing, I had been waiting specifically for this, for us to be at the front together. The formal declaration I had not made that first Sunday at this church. I made it now, standing next to my parents, standing as a family. We were baptized together a few weeks later, all four of us, my father, my mother, me, and my brother Yusuf, who was 9 years old and had watched the whole journey of his family from a child's perspective, and had decided with the simple and complete faith that 9-year-olds are capable of, that he was in. Whatever his family was doing, he was in. When my father came up out of the water at that baptism, the expression on his face was something I have tried many times to describe, and cannot fully capture. I will just say that it was the face of a man who had found what he had been looking for his whole life, without knowing he was looking for it. It was the face of a man who had not lost anything, a man who had gained everything. That is the day I want to end this part with. Not the hard conversations, not the grief and the distance and the weeks of difficulty. Those were real and they mattered, and I am not going to pretend they did not happen. But the day I want you to carry with you from this part of the story is that Baptism Sunday. 4 members of one family going into the water and coming up different, not different from each other. The same, more the same than they had ever been, because they were finally all standing on the same ground, under the same sky, held by the same love. My name is Amira Hassan. I am 13 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, to Jordanian parents who were Muslim. I am a Christian. My parents are Christians. My brother is a Christian. And I am the one who, by the grace of God and nothing else, went first. I want to sit with that for a moment before I tell you about what our life looks like now, because it still does something to me when I say it plainly like that. Not with pride, because this was not my accomplishment. I did not engineer my family's salvation. I did not have a strategy or a plan. I was a curious, question-filled little girl who read a book at a kitchen table and had a dream and could not keep what happened inside me from eventually finding its way into the light. That is all. God did the rest. God did all of it, really. I was just the one He chose to go first. And I have thoughts about that many times, about why He would choose an 11-year-old girl to be the one who opened the door. And I think the answer is that children are sometimes the bravest people in a family. Not because we are stronger, but because we have not yet learned all the ways that fear is supposed to stop us. I was not smart enough to be as afraid as I probably should have been. And I think God counted on that. I want to be honest with you about the aftermath, because I think sometimes testimonies jump from the miracle moment, the conversion, the baptism, the breakthrough, straight to, and now everything is wonderful. And that is not the whole truth of what happens. What happened to our family after we came to Jesus was wonderful. But it was also complicated. And the complication was real, and it cost us something, and I think you should know that. The first and most immediate complication was extended family. My father has a brother in Jordan and 2 sisters who are still there. He has cousins scattered between Jordan, Germany, and other parts of the United States. My mother has her parents, my grandparents, here in Columbus. These are people who love us. These are people who are part of us. And when the news traveled, as news always travels in tight-knit Middle Eastern family communities, that Tariq and Nadia Hassan had left Islam and become Christians, the response was not neutral. My grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father, stopped speaking to my father for months, not to my mother, but to my father, because in the logic of the family dynamic, my father was the head of the house, and what had happened to the family's faith was, in that framing, his responsibility and his failure. My grandfather was not a cruel man. He was a man whose faith was his whole framework, and who experienced his son-in-law's conversion as something close to a betrayal, not of him personally, of everything. My father's brother in Jordan called several times in the first weeks after the news spread. Those conversations were long and hard, and I was not in the room for most of them, but I could hear the weight of them in how my father carried himself on the days they happened. He came out of those calls tired in a way that was deeper than physical. He was having to hold his new faith and his old family love at the same time in the same hands, and figure out how not to drop either one. My mother's friends from the mosque community, women she had known for years, women who had been to our house and whose houses we had been to. The connections with most of them frayed significantly. Not all of them. A couple of them, to their genuine credit, kept the friendship intact and remain in our lives today. But the majority drifted, not dramatically, not with confrontation, just the slow pulling away of people who do not know how to be around something they cannot categorize in their existing framework. We had become, in the eyes of that community, people who had left. And in tight religious communities of any kind, people who leave carry a particular kind of social weight. I felt all of this. I want to be clear that I felt the cost of what my curiosity had set in motion. When my mother's friend group contracted, when I could see my father carrying the heaviness of his strained relationship with his brother, when my grandmother on my mother's side looked at me at a family gathering with an expression that mixed love with something that was clearly grief and confusion. I felt these things. I was not sheltered from the cost. And there were moments, quiet moments late at night in my room, when I asked Jesus whether it was supposed to be this hard, whether the price was too high, whether I had understood something wrong. The answer that came back every single time was not yes and not no. The answer that came back was the same peace, the same groundedness, the same warmth that did not depend on circumstances and did not shift with the difficulty level of my situation. It was the constant underneath everything, and it was enough. Every time I questioned whether it was too hard, that peace came and it was enough. And I got up the next morning and kept going. I want to tell you what my father is like now, because I think his transformation is the part of this story that I find most extraordinary, and I want to give it the space it deserves. My father was, before, a serious man. Warm, but serious. A man who felt the weight of things. A man whose faith manifested primarily as discipline and structure, and the keeping of obligations. He was a good father and a good husband, but there was something in him that was always slightly held back, slightly reserved, slightly at a managed distance from the full expression of what he felt. I did not notice it as a child because it was simply how he was, and it was all I knew. I only noticed the contrast later when I saw what changed. After he gave his life to Jesus, my father became lighter. I do not mean he became less serious or less responsible. He is still the most responsible person I know. I mean that something that had been held tightly in him released. Like a fist that had been closed for a very long time finally opened. He laughs more easily now. He cries more easily now too, and from a man who never cried in front of us. This was initially startling and is now one of my favorite things about him. He cries at church. Sometimes. He cried at my baptism. He cried at my brother's school play. He cries when he prays sometimes, and his prayers are different now. Not in form only, but in texture. They are the prayers of someone who believes he is talking to a person who is listening. Not submitting reports to an authority who may or may not acknowledge receipt. He reads his Bible the way he used to read engineering documents. Carefully, marking things, going back over sections, cross-referencing. He has become, in the 2 years since his conversion, a deeply serious student of the faith. He leads our family in devotions on Sunday mornings before church. He prays over us individually. He has become the spiritual leader of our house in a way that is new, because the spirituality he is leading from is not the spirituality of discipline and distance, but of relationship and presence, and the kind of love that runs toward you before you have done anything to deserve it. Watching my father pray now compared to watching him pray as a child when I used to peek through the door of his room is like watching two different things. Both were real, both were sincere, but one was a man maintaining a discipline, and the other is a man talking to his father. The difference is enormous. My mother is flourishing in a way that is beautiful. She found in faith what she had always had in character, warmth and hospitality and generosity, and discovered that these things she had always possessed were not just her personality, they were her calling. She has become involved in a ministry at our church that serves families in need. She cooks for people, she opens our home. The same qualities that made people love her before have found a context that feels like their natural home. She told me once that she had always known she was made for something, that she had always sensed a purpose she could not name, and that following Jesus had given her the name for it. I believe her. I can see it in how she moves through her days. Let me tell you about my faith now. At 13 years old, not the history of it, I have told you that in detail, but what it looks like on a regular Tuesday, what it is made of in the ordinary texture of my life. I wake up in the morning and I talk to Jesus before I do anything else. Not a long, formal prayer, just a conversation. Sometimes it is short. Sometimes, if I am worried about something, it goes longer. I tell him what is on my mind. I tell him what I am nervous about. Sometimes I just say good morning and thank you. It is the most natural thing in my day, more natural than breakfast. I read my Bible, not every single day without exception, because I am going to be honest with you. I am 13 and there are days when I am running late, or I am tired, or I am distracted and I do not read as I intended. But most days. And when I read, I am still experiencing what I experienced the first time, that the words are alive, that they keep giving, that no matter how many times I have read a passage, there is something in it that I have not seen before. I do not know how to explain that, except to say it is one of the clearest signs to me that this book is not an ordinary book. I go to church, and I genuinely love it. Not in the way I am supposed to love it or have been told to love it. I genuinely look forward to Sunday. The music does something to me that nothing else does. The community of people around me, knowing they are there because of the same thing, the same Jesus, the same encounter with the same grace, makes me feel less alone in a way that is hard to describe but very real to me. I also struggle. I want to say that clearly. I struggle with impatience. I struggle with my brother sometimes, who can be very annoying in the specific way that 11-year-old brothers are designed to be annoying. I struggle with pressure at school. I struggle sometimes with the feeling of being in between two worlds, not quite fully American in the way some of my classmates are American, not quite fully part of the Middle Eastern culture my parents came from, and now also Christian in a way that does not fit neatly into the category most people put Jordanian girls in. When they hear about your family, I am always slightly between things. I have made peace with that. I actually think it is a gift. Being between things gives you a view that people who only stand in one place do not have. I want to talk about my classmates and my generation for a moment because I think about this a lot. I am 13. Most of the people I know my age are not thinking seriously about God. And I understand that. I was not always thinking seriously about God either, and I had more early exposure to these questions than most of my classmates did. I understand that being young in this cultural moment means being surrounded by things that are much louder and more immediately engaging than questions about eternity and meaning and who Jesus is. I understand that these questions can feel abstract and old and irrelevant to a life that is full of school and friendships and social pressure, and all the noise of being 13 in the 21st century. But I want to say something to people my age, and I want to say it plainly because I think plain is the only way to say it. I know what peace feels like, not the absence of difficulty, not the temporary relief that comes from a good day or a good song or a moment of feeling liked and included. I mean the deep structural, underneath everything peace that does not move when things get hard. I know what it feels like to be fully known and fully loved at the same time. I know what it feels like to have a real relationship with a real God who is not a set of rules or a distant authority, but a person who knows your name and knows your history and knows all the embarrassing details of who you are and loves you anyway. I found that at 10 years old in a kitchen in Columbus. I did not have to wait until I was grown. I did not have to earn it. I did not have to have my life figured out. I just had to be honest enough to say I believe, and to mean it. And if a Muslim girl from a Muslim home can find that, if a little girl whose first language of faith was Arabic and whose God was presented to her as distant and great and separate, could encounter the close God, the running God, the God who says come, then I genuinely do not believe there is anyone who is too far. I do not believe there is a background that is too different, or a history that is too complicated, or a sin that is too heavy. I do not believe there is a category of person to whom Jesus says, no, actually, you are outside the range of what I came for. He came for everyone. He died for everyone. He rose for everyone. I know that is a large claim. I know that many people will read it and feel skeptical or challenged or even offended. I am not asking you to feel nothing about it. I am asking you to be as honest as I was. I am asking you to pick up the book and read it, not to be converted, but to understand. And let what is in it do what it does. Let the stories be what they are. Let Jesus be who he is in those pages. And then make your decision from a place of real encounter, not second-hand information. I want to speak directly to some people now, different people, because I think this story touches different people in different ways, and I want to speak to each of them if I can. To the Muslim person who is reading this and feeling some form of recognition. I know this is complicated. I know the web of identity and family and culture and community that this faith is woven into. I know that considering Jesus is not a simple intellectual exercise for you. It is a social and familial and cultural upheaval that carries real cost. I know that better than most people who have never lived inside that web. I am not asking you to leave your family. I am not asking you to abandon your culture or your heritage or your community. I am asking you to consider that the God you are seeking is perhaps not as far as you have been told. I am asking you to consider that there might be a bridge between the sincerity of what you believe and the fullness of what you are looking for. Jesus does not come to take from you. He comes to complete. He comes to fill what is still empty. He comes to close the distance. Consider him, not from the outside, from the inside. Read the Gospels. Read them the way you would want someone to read the Quran, with respect and genuine attention, and the willingness to let the words be what they are. And ask God, whatever name you call God by, ask God to show you what is true. If you ask that sincerely, I believe with everything in me that you will be answered. To the Christian person who is reading this and perhaps has been a Christian for so long that some of the aliveness has gone out of it, I want to say to you, with all the gentleness I have, the Jesus in these pages is not a tradition. He is not a background. He is not the God of your childhood that you have filed away under familiar. He is alive. The same Jesus who found a little Muslim girl in a kitchen in Ohio is the same Jesus who found you, wherever he found you. He has not gone anywhere. The aliveness that first gripped you is still there. It did not expire. If you have drifted, if the peace has gotten buried under the routine, if you have been going through the motions and trying not to examine too closely the feeling that something important has gone quiet in you, I want to tell you what I know at 13 years old from the only experience I have, which is short but which is real. He's still close. He has not moved. The door is still open. You do not have to perform a dramatic return. You just have to start talking to him again. Honestly, wherever you are, with whatever you have, he will meet you there. He always meets you there. To the person who does not believe in God at all, or who has looked at Christianity specifically and found it wanting, who has heard the arguments and weighed the evidence and concluded that there is nothing there, I want to say something to you too, not to argue with you, because I am 13 years old and I am not equipped to win a theological argument with a serious skeptic, and I know that. But I want to say this: I was not argued into faith. No one sat me down and dismantled my objections and rebuilt my worldview on Christian premises. I was encountered. I was touched by something that had no other explanation. I felt the presence of someone real in ways that I could not manufacture or explain away. I am not asking you to take my experience as evidence. I am not asking you to believe because I believe. I am asking you to consider the possibility that the absence of an encounter is not the same as the absence of someone to encounter. And I am asking you to be willing, just willing, to say the most honest prayer you have ever prayed, which might just be, if you are real, show me, and then to mean it. I cannot promise you what will happen after that. I can only tell you what happened to me, and what happened to a Muslim girl who asked a question like that and could not stop following the answer wherever it led. I am almost at the end of my story, and there are two more things I want to say. The first is about my name, Amira. It is an Arabic name. It means princess. My father chose it because he wanted his daughter to carry something beautiful from his culture, something that meant she was valued, treasured, set apart. I have never changed my name, and I never will. Not because I am holding on to an identity that conflicts with my faith, but because there is no conflict. My name is Arabic, my heritage is Jordanian. The food I love most is my mother's cooking. I know Arabic words that I carry inside me from childhood like small warm stones. These things are not cancelled by Jesus. They are not erased by the cross. God did not find me and then ask me to become a different ethnicity. He found Amira. He called Amira. He loved Amira as she was, as she is. Your background is not a barrier. Your culture is not a wall. Your heritage is not a disqualification. You are not required to become something. You are not in order to be received. You are received as you are. That is the whole point of the gospel. That is what the running father means. He ran toward the son who was still wearing the clothes from the pig pen. He did not make him change first. The second thing I want to say is to my parents. Mom and Dad, if you ever read this, I want you to know that becoming a Christian was not a rejection of you. It was never a rejection of you. It was the most honest thing I knew how to do, and it led to the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, which is you, both of you, walking into that church that Sunday, standing at that altar, coming up out of that water. I will see those images for the rest of my life. I will see them, and they will never stop making me cry, and they will never stop making me grateful. I did not lead you to Jesus. Jesus led you to Jesus, and I was just the small thing he used to begin the process. But I was there. I got to be there, and that is a gift I do not have words big enough to hold. My name is Amira Hassan. I am 13 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, to a Muslim family from Jordan. I found Jesus at a kitchen table when I was 10, in a borrowed Bible, in the words of a story that is 2,000 years old and has not stopped being alive for a single day of those 2,000 years. My mother found him in her kitchen late at night, in the story of a father who ran. My father found him in the pages of a book he had been reading, looking for the place it fell apart, and instead found the thing that holds everything together. We are a family who came from one faith and found in the middle of our ordinary American life a God who was not waiting for us to come to him, but who was already coming toward us, who had always been coming toward us. If you are reading this and you are still on the road, still far away, still in the pig pen or the desert or wherever your version of far from home feels like, I want you to know something. There is a figure at the end of the road. He has been there the whole time. And when you are still a long way off, he will see you and he will run. Come home. Come to Jesus. He has been looking for you.